How do you follow a performance peak captured on film? How do you top breaking the Beatles' attendance record? By 1975, Led Zeppelin returned to America at their most massive. It looked perfect, but was it? Beneath the scale, something had changed. The playing was still there, but the mindset felt different. A brutal blizzard, injuries, vocal struggles, and a spark that took time to reignite after nearly 2 years away. This is the story of Led Zeppelin's 1975 US tour, the moment they were tested like never before.
Here we are! Good night!
It's July 29th, 1973. Led Zeppelin walked off the stage after 3 nights at Madison Square Garden, the final stop of their North American tour. One by one, they leave the spotlight behind and step into a new, uncertain chapter. This was the danger of being at the top. How do you sustain momentum when there's nowhere left to climb? The first test came quickly. That same day, $200,000 vanished from their safe deposit box. Just like that, gone. It was a perfect signal to leave. Zeppelin said goodbye to America and flew home for a much-needed break. 1973 marked the end of an era. Their contract with Atlantic Records expired on Halloween, giving them the freedom to start their own label. But before anything else, they stopped completely. No more shows. Not a few weeks, not a couple of months, a year and a half. For a band built on chemistry, improvisation, and constant motion, it was a risky move. The hot iron that once drove them forward began to cool. In the words of Robert Plant, "You need coolin'," and they certainly did. Film plans resumed. Time was spent at home, and money continued to flow in. Zeppelin had reached a level where continuation itself risked repetition. They had done it all. Gold records, broken attendance records, global domination. Now came the part no band is ever fully prepared for. What happens after you've already won? Sessions for physical graffiti began, but even here, cracks appeared. John Paul Jones stepped away to spend time with his family and explore new musical directions. Not officially quitting, but close enough to raise real questions. For a moment, they were the Zeppelin trio. Jones eventually returned, but the moment mattered. It showed that even within the most powerful band in the world, balance wasn't guaranteed. 1974 became a year away from the stage. Business replaced touring. Meetings, label work, and the launch of Swan Song Records shifted their focus. The machine kept running, but differently. They were still winning, but now they didn't have to step on a stage to do it. Bad Company made them millions. And maybe that was a problem. The closest they came to performing live that year was something stranger than anyone expected. Inside Shepperton Studios, miming to pre-recorded tracks from Madison Square Garden to fill in some of the more unusual gaps from the original film. And everything looked different. Plant had changed physically. Page seemed distant. And Bonham and Jones showed subtle shifts that were hard to ignore. Even wigs were used to recreate the past after cutting their hair. They were playing the same music, but not living inside it. And somewhere in that artificial performance, a question started to form. Could they really go back to what they were? Watching them mime to Dazed and Confused, with a visible camera rig moving through the set, says it all. Was Zeppelin now living inside a fishbowl of their own success? American fans received exciting news in late December 1974. Led Zeppelin were back on tour in the United States in 1975. Anticipation grew quickly, and there was one more surprise yet to be revealed. Unlike their last 3 albums, the band would hit the road just as their new record arrived in stores. What no one knew yet was that it would be a double album. Tickets went on sale during the week of January 6th, and chaos followed. Desperation took over as fans flooded box offices across the country. In Boston, things escalated to the point where 2,500 people trashed the city's garden while waiting in line, forcing the show to be cancelled. Everyone wanted to see Led Zeppelin. The band had reached another level. Reports from the West Coast were just as intense. Every seat for their shows in March was already sold out. Absence had done its job. The band had been away, and now they were more valuable than ever. But as the outlook brightened for promoters, something else was unfolding across the country. The Great Storm of 1975 hit in mid-January, bringing extreme cold and record snowfall to large parts of the United States. Entire cities were covered by snow. Travel slowed, conditions worsened, and Zeppelin's American tour hadn't begun yet. While the US battled the weather, the band played 2 warm-up shows in Holland and Belgium, but they sounded rusty in places. Coming back to lengthy jams and cues wasn't immediate. The old numbers felt slightly worn, while the new physical graffiti material leaned into mid-tempos, rhythm-driven structures, and a different kind of flow. It was a subtle shift, but a noticeable one. By the time they arrived in America for the opening shows there, more problems surfaced. The road crew wasn't thrilled about the conditions, especially the snow. In their words, the motherfucking snow. The blizzard didn't just slow logistics, it hit the band directly. Robert Plant came down with the flu, and it showed. His voice struggled in places, cracking and straining through the early shows. Songs like In My Time of Dying suddenly lived up to their title. His vocals needed rest, but just like January 1973, when illness caught up with him in the UK, cancelling shows wasn't really an option. The tour had to move forward. Jimmy Page was next. He injured a finger on his left hand, forcing him into a 3-finger technique and last-minute adjustments to his playing, solos, rhythm parts, everything. It affected not just execution, but feel. Dazed and Confused was dropped from the set in January and replaced with How Many More Times, which for a band returning after nearly 2 years away wasn't exactly the ideal substitute, and they didn't have many options. Everything in Zeppelin's catalog is demanding, much like carrying Page's Les Paul or Double Neck. The setlist had a strange pacing. 8 songs carried over from the previous tour, but the contrast with the new physical graffiti material felt uneven. Sick Again fit naturally. It carried the swagger of 1973, but the other songs leaned into mid-tempo vibes and longer forms the band hadn't fully absorbed on stage yet. That shift began to affect the flow of the show. Even staples like No Quarter and Bonham's Moby Dick started to feel different, less spontaneous, more contained. You don't take a long break and suddenly step into something bigger. 1975 Zeppelin feels like the 1995 Chicago Bulls, when Jordan returned, but they weren't ready for the playoffs. Chemistry-wise, the old classics were still there. Black Dog leading into Holy Love was still getting huge reactions, but placed later in the set. They started to feel like afterthoughts rather than centerpieces. For the first time, the growth of a Led Zeppelin show felt linear, not upward. Even newer additions like the Wanton song didn't make it past January, hinting at a setlist still searching for balance. The thrill wasn't gone, but it had changed. They felt more vulnerable, despite their killer musicianship. Certain moments became expected. The set began to settle into patterns, even as the band worked through the demands of the new material. From a musician standpoint, that shift is real. It's arguably harder to play something like Kashmir than Dazed and Confused. With its repetitive structure, there is no room to drift, lose focus for a second, and the whole thing collapses. Zeppelin had always thrived on improvisation, on the thrill of the unknown, but now they were navigating on something different, playing inside a fixed framework.
So that's one of the new ones.
Jumble Jones remained precise, grounded, arguably the most adaptable to the new material, including his use of fretless bass. His playing stayed consistent throughout the tour, acting as a stabilizing force. Visually though, even he reflected the shift. Shorter hair, a retro 50s presence. Subtle, but it added to the sense that this wasn't quite the same Zeppelin. John Bonham's Vistalite kit from 1973 was now placed on top of a black drum riser. Elevated above the band, he had to rise to the occasion. His stamina and role had evolved, and he arguably had the toughest job on stage. Possibly inspired by tours like Emerson, Lake and Palmer the year before, Bonzo's drum riser elevation was a turning point. Zeppelin's stage design changed. It opened the floor. Jimmy and Robert had more space to move, unlocking new mannerisms as performers. In many ways, 1975 looked like the future of rock and roll. A large fabric backdrop, lit to match the mood of each song, added a new visual dimension. Compared to 1973, it felt bigger, more modern. But there was a trade-off. For a band that spent years playing close together, physically and musically, the riser introduced separation. Communication changed. It's one thing to hear what the guitar, bass, and vocals are doing. It's another to lock eyes and shift direction in real time. That subtle difference mattered. Based on the bootleg recordings, it took them time to fully adjust. This wasn't just a bigger stage, it was a different way of playing together, something they would fully master by 1977. Give this setup to the 1973 band, and they probably adapt instantly. But in 1975, after nearly 2 years away from the road, that adjustment wasn't automatic. Yes, Bonham had powerful monitors beside him, but Zeppelin's chemistry had always been built on proximity, on reacting in the moment. The riser changed that dynamic. This was a new version of Led Zeppelin, closer to the emerging stadium rock format seen at large festivals like California Jam. It likely made life easier for sound engineers, and audiences loved the scale. But for the band, it meant recalibrating how their superpowers worked. Freedom of movement had increased, but so had the distance between them. And that wasn't the only change. Visually, the band's identity reflected moving colors. In late 1972 and 73, their look was consistent, recognizable. By contrast, 1975 felt more fluid. Page and Plant changed outfits, city to city, and the sense of a defined visual identity wasn't as clear. Even Jimmy's dragon suit, now synonymous with this era, didn't fully arrive until the Earl's Court shows in May. Too many changes at once. The stage, the set, the clothing, the machine moving at full speed, but still adjusting to a new reality. They could never go back to that early appetite. Now it was about enduring the trials and tribulations of superstardom with every form of pleasure at their disposal. This was their first true tour of excess, if they chose to embrace it. I'm not saying they didn't have a drink or two before, but the stakes were so high this time they were trying to come to terms to their new power. All this with the press firmly on their side. And yet moments of identity still broke through. John Bonham's look, clearly inspired by Alex on A Clockwork Orange, felt instantly iconic. If there's one visual that defines 1975, that might be it. Maybe Stanley Kubrick should have directed. The song remains the same. Even the stage design raised questions. The band's name appeared on a large backdrop. A bold move, but one that lacked the mystique of their earlier imagery. Compared to the more subtle aesthetic of past years, this felt more direct, almost theatrical. It was cutting-edge technology at the time, but it didn't age particularly well, and it's no surprise it was gone by 1977. What exactly was the band trying to present? A concert? A spectacle? Something closer to cinema? And after the Shepperton filming experience, was there now a different awareness of being watched? As a Zeppelin historian, collector, and live performer of their music, this tour doesn't rank among my top 5, but through this journey I come to understand why. I'm always chasing the human element behind the art. Technique alone means nothing. Context is everything. 1975 wasn't the fall of Led Zeppelin. It was the moment they realized they couldn't rely on instinct alone anymore. The power was still there, the crowds were bigger than ever, but the way they had to sustain that power was different. This was a band learning how to operate under different conditions, closer to the controlled environment of Shepperton Studios than the raw instinct of earlier years. This was Led Zeppelin learning how to be their later selves. It also marked the end of certain ideas. Dazed and Confused, a cornerstone since 1968, made its final American appearance on this tour, a signal that even the most iconic improvisational vehicle had reached its limit in this form. The band would move forward, reshaping those instincts into something new, eventually finding different outlets in later material. Much like Physical Graffiti itself, an album built from outtakes across different periods, this tour carried pieces of Zeppelin's past, familiar sounds, familiar tools, familiar moments, but by the next tour, many of those elements would be gone. The look would change, the approach would evolve, and the band would return with a different kind of control. 1975 wasn't about losing something, it was about crossing a line. The moment where what came naturally had to be rebuilt with intention, and in that sense, it may not have been their musical peak, but it was one of their most important turning points. And maybe that's the irony. Some of the most photographed moments in our lives are the ones where behind the scenes, we're still trying to figure things out. If you want to explore what came next, you can check out My Earl's Court, the 1977 tour, and the Song Remains the Same playlists. Links are in the description below. And to my dear patrons, thank you for making this possible, and for staying committed to the music. Until the next time, thank you for watching. Bye bye.